Okay, we are live again.
Okay, we're live again, and I apologize for, going into recess and whatnot. I'm reading this, and then our solicitor is gonna come and gonna read the same thing, and I don't think you folks twice. Let me tell you a couple things. Let me bring you up to speed. I talked to the gentleman about the Wawa. There seems to be some concern about Wawa, and I realize this isn't on the agenda. This is for your information type thing. And they said they will be starting August the 2nd is when they'll be starting the Wawa. So there's rumors out there that they're not coming or what have you. And I just want to let you know that I talked to the gentleman. He said August the 2nd is when they're going to start putting in the tanks and so forth. And again, this is for your information. This is not, I don't want to get a FOIA violation because it wasn't on the agenda, but I just wanted to try to make some clarifications for some folks out there. But if you want to follow FOIA, help yourself. Okay, gentlemen, again, I don't want to read this because if I do, he's going to come in and read the same thing to you that I'm reading. And again, I apologize to everyone out there waiting. He got caught in the fair traffic, so he should be here in a few minutes. So he wasn't anticipating the fair. Obviously, he's never been here during the fair. Had he would have known. So we can just sit here and wait. If that's all right with you folks out there in Facebook land.
This one here, Delaware's a legal state, so how do we go about enforcing that?
I don't know how many people are watching. Can we ask, like, any questions they can send in that we can answer while we're sitting here?
Yeah, okay.
It'd have to be relative to this.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Okay.
This is,
I wasn't sure.
well, and and I agree with the recessing, but there are those people who think when we go to recess, there's some kind of big secret or what have you. In which case it's not.
Legislation they're pushing to still doesn't affect me. It would be law enforcement, transportation, somebody else that it would be, we still couldn't, you know what I mean? For now. So I was there looking, I was like, I don't enforce that.
It's just like a call.
Fair enough.
Are you close? Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you. Bye. Mr. Nicola says he's about 3 minutes out. He's gotten through the fair traffic, so he should be here in a matter of a few minutes, so.
Sounds good.
Please bear with us.
The link for the, to the live.
So I'm assuming everybody's got their questions, so we can go through this relatively quick instead of holding everybody up.
We don't have.
Mr. Massey, you have your question, I'm assuming?
Yeah, Dan actually just helped me out with one, everything else seems fairly cut and dry.
Okay. Mr. Willie?
Yeah, I've read them all over,
Maureen, you,
pretty much all of it, I think.
hopefully then that way when he gets there, he goes over all the stuff that I've read that bored the folks. We're gonna go through this and address it rather rapidly, rather than keep him here all night.
Sounds good.
Yeah, the individual that couldn't hear, can they hear now, or haven't they said
They haven't
anything?
said, but I went and checked it and it said no.
You got sound.
Not here.
Yeah, he just pulled up.
We can't have it down there.
We are live, so don't say anything derogatory about our traffic.
Understood. Well, it's
Welcome
just,
to the Delaware State Fair.
I would just say that that's a great justification for a bond bill to get like more lanes around
It's only this time
around
of
where
year.
that is, because what normally takes me about an hour and a half ended up taking me pretty much 2 hours. And it's been a long time since I sat in traffic at the state fair, so I forgot it was this time of year and did not anticipate.
So I started to read the proposal and changes, and I decided not to because you're probably gonna go over the same thing, and I didn't wanna bore the folks twice.
Sure.
There was also a discussion and possible vote on premium pay of employees. Did Jamie discuss that with you?
He did, and I can summarize for council's
Okay,
consideration.
good.
So, and I'm actually pulling up the current inclement weather policy right now, if you'll bear with me. So first, I'll preface this by saying that this actually relates to a performance issue of a employee. So I'm not going to mention the employee's name because that's technically confidential information and would be construed as an invasion of privacy. So for those listening at home who like to file what I would consider to be frivolous FOIA complaints, that was part of the reason why this matter was discussed previously in executive session, because this relates to the performance of an employee. So I will not mention the employee's name, but to summarize, this particular individual was, I guess, asked whether or not they could work or receive premium pay for a time that under the policy, council was closed and no one was here. And so there was a discussion with that employee supervisor that, based upon what the policy says, if they did not in fact physically report in to work, then they should not work, that there was no need for them to do anything from home, and that would be fine, because it's tough weather, you can't get in, it's dangerous, you can't clear yourself out. Okay. Well, unfortunately, as it turns out, this particular individual did not comply with the instruction of their supervisor and proceeded to work. And then after working, even though they did not have to leave their house, was requesting the processing of premium pay, which is time and a half pay, that is not, to me, in the spirit or the language of the policy. It really is about when people are home and you're required to report here. It's like extra pay when somebody's exposing themselves to that, to that set of circumstances. So my recommendation is that we follow the policy as I interpret it, which I think is consistent with what the language of the policy says. And that under that circumstance, it would not be appropriate to process that request for premium pay. So I would, unless there are questions, I would think that a motion would be in order to basically not proceed with giving premium pay under those circumstances.
Okay, and you've talked to Jamie about this, and that's what he's,
Yeah, so Jamie's involvement was specifically in reference to the FOIA aspect of this. And so we're doing this now in a manner that's as public as I believe it can be, in light of the fact that this relates to what could be construed as an internal personnel issue in this employee's performance, which is like squarely within the bounds of like why we have executive session and that exemption in FOIA. So that was, this is essentially us making sure that we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's and having a discussion about this request in open session, so that there are no potential FOIA challenges.
Okay.
The layman's terms, you're just suggesting, if you want to get paid time and a half for inclement weather, you actually have to physically show up, which is kind of what we come to the
That's right.
justification of anyway. If you want time and a half, you gotta be here. If not,
It's there to, to quite literally, Councilman Massey, it's there to account for people who
Yeah.
leave their house, are exposed to the elements, exposed to a hazardous condition, and this is
you
like,
put yourself in a
Yes.
compromising position and you will be paid accordingly.
that's right.
Right.
In this case, that didn't happen, so it would not implicate the policy. The other thing is that, the handbook is clear on its face that it doesn't create a contract and that the council has discretion to apply it. So to the extent that this were a close call, I would say that language gives you the discretion to say, in this circumstance, we would like to not proceed with premium pay because the person didn't actually have to go out in the elements.
Right.
But I don't really think it is that close, but to the extent that there was any thought that this was like a close call, I think between the acknowledgement at the beginning that says this isn't a contract and council has the discretion, I think that, either exercise your discretion or apply the language as written, either way you cut it, I don't think that you should process premium pay in this circumstance.
So do we have a motion?
I make a motion.
And the motion is, please?
The motion is not to pay premium pay in this particular instance to the employee based on how the policy is written and interpreted.
Okay, do I have a second? Second. I have a motion by Mr. Nelson, second by Mr. Moran. Are there any questions to the motion?
No, but moving forward, the precedent set, I would, at this point, we've set a precedent. If you can't show up during inclement weather, then you don't get the time and a half.
I think it's in the
That's all I
handbook.
need
isn't
to
it?
add to that.
Mr. Massey, how do you vote?
Yes.
Mr. Nelson?
Yes.
Mr. Willie?
Yes.
Mr. Moran?
Yes.
And I vote yes, unanimous. Okay, moving on. Council workshop for discussion employee handbook revisions and updates.
So you have two documents in front of you. One is a memorandum that I prepared that kind of runs through what I would, construe as a summary of the changes. And then you also have another document which has the parts that are underlined would be like new language. So I think the most efficient way to do this, because there are a number of proposed changes, is just to start with the memo and run through what the changes are. The memo does discuss them, I think, in relatively sort of like numerical order of when they appear, starting at like the beginning of the handbook and then going towards the end. The only thing that's a little bit weird is that towards the end, you'll see there's a reference of including language in an acknowledgement that used to be at the beginning, which is the employee acknowledgement, which I changed to the end and added to the appendix because I think it makes more sense to put it there. That this is not creating some sort of agreement to arbitrate an employment dispute, that would have to be actually entered into. So we added that language as well as other language to the employee acknowledgement, but I'll get to that at the end because that's at the end of the document in front of you. So the first change, which I would, in your memo, first bullet point, municipal authority and controlling law clause just adds a controlling law provision, making it clear that the handbook is subordinate to the charter and then the code and then ordinances and resolutions. And then council approved agreements and specific procedures that are promulgated. So it sort of like lays out the order, sort of like how you learned in civic class, the Constitution, then the laws, then any regulations that are authorized to be made by the executive branch from those laws. So it lays it out in that order, essentially acknowledging that this is a handbook, this is a guide for how we're going to administer your benefits and for what the expectations are for your conduct. But, there are other things of control. Like, for example, there's language in the charter that allows for certain contracts to be entered into. I mean, you can really contract with whomever you wanted, but there's specific both precedent and language in the charter that alludes to the ability to have a contract for the town manager or for the chief of police. So even though there's references, and that's bullet point 2, to employment at will, which is actually something else that's pointed out in another part of your charter, because the handbook says employment at will, that would not mean that your current town manager and your current chief of police, who are subject to contracts, would necessarily be construed as employees at will. You defer first to what their employment contract says. So for anyone who's not familiar with the idea of employment at will, who's listening at home, that basically just reaffirms the language in the charter, which is that, folks who are employed here can quit if they wish to. The town can discharge them. It doesn't have to be for any particular reason or for cause. It's a freedom to have someone work or not work based upon the discretion of the town. And there are places where there is delegation of authority to department heads. I think in practice, you're not going to see that too much because half of your employees are police officers, and there's a whole different set of rules about how you would address a police officer in terms of ceasing their employment that we don't have to get into. But for everyone who's not a police officer and who's not subject to a contract, it's employment at will. And this makes that clear. So change 3 addresses the discrimination and harassment process and talks about the way that those should be digested. You've got 2 major departments. You've got the administrative side and you've got the law enforcement side. So it emphasizes that if you've got a complaint, you should submit those to the heads of those departments, which would be the manager or the chief of police, as the case may be. And then it adds a detailed who gets reported to whom, depending upon if there are certain folks involved. Like if there's an allegation of mistreatment or harassment being perpetuated by the chief of police, and you're a police officer, you wouldn't, go to the chief of police necessarily. So there is an elaboration in the handbook about how those reports would proceed. So that's bullet point 3. For 4, the grievance procedure as drafted was difficult to understand, and I don't know that it was necessarily historically being followed per se, but what we've done is made it clear that if you've got a desire to have a grievance involving your employment or some issue related to your employment, that it's council as a whole that has the ability to resolve that grievance. So it's something that would need to be, you've got 6 employees. This is not unduly cumbersome by virtue of how small the town is, that if there's a matter that rises to the level of needing to be resolved by council, there's a grievance as described in the handbook, that the way it would go in practice, as I envision this, the language says this, but let's say that somebody on the administrative side has a problem and it's initially discussed with the town manager and it can't be resolved at the lowest level, which is what the handbook contemplates. The town manager would then request an executive session to address the issue because it likely would fall into the FOIA exemption about performance, personnel issues, and so on. There's possibilities where it wouldn't, so it might have to be discussed in executive session, but the default might not be able to be discussed in executive session, The default would be to proceed in that way, though, I think, for most instances. So that's how it would work in practice. And this just makes it clear, and that's really consistent with what the charter says, because your charter, which is also consistent with like how all municipalities in the state of Delaware function, you make decisions as a body of the whole. No individual, unless there's an express delegation of authority, has the ability to bind the town as to any particular matter. So this kind of goes into that way of doing things. There are specific administrative decisions that can be made involving like summary discipline for an employee that doesn't implicate due process rights, things like reprimands potentially, or counseling sessions, things like that wouldn't really require your involvement. But this provides that pathway if there's like a grievance about an employee benefit, some other issue that can't be resolved via one of the 2 department heads, that gives you the employee the ability to address this and to essentially come and say, here's what my concern is, and then it provides a more formalized mechanism for you all to appreciate that and make a decision about how to resolve it. So that's the grievance procedure, and like I was alluding to before, there is a current grievance procedure. It's not really clear on what happens or how it's addressed and the various steps and so forth, so we streamlined it and made it like, informal resolution, and then you can't resolve it informally, it gets placed probably as an executive session item for council to consider. That's point 4. Bullet point 5 relates to how you would actually go about literally pursuing a report of a concern like a grievance, and that, one council member alone does not by themselves constitute submission and like, okay, everyone suddenly somehow knows that this thing exists. It's got to be digested by council, like put on an agenda, or, although this is probably something I would not recommend, and I would recommend that the town manager, the chief, tell their employees not to just email blast everyone, because it could create the possibility of like a FOIA quorum problem, that it would be better to go through the channel of the department head and then being duly noticed and everything like that for a FOIA compliance standpoint. But the point is that you can't just have a singular report to Councilman Willie and then presume that that's going to be like, well, it's now been addressed. No, like it has to actually, for lack of a better term, be docketed on a agenda and noticed in such a way that council can actually address it in the way that's required under the town charter. So item 6 in the memo addresses the fact that, certainly there's some nice language in the current handbook about equal employment, anti-discrimination, anti-harassment, and that is preserved in the current draft, but there's basically just some, what I would call modernization and updating of the language. And it ties them into the expanded complaint process to allow for employee protection, and makes clear that, Greenwood, as a matter of policy, discourages retaliation, and here's a process that we're adopting to make sure that the possibility of retaliation is minimized, especially with a relatively small employee workforce that you have. Item 7 is, we're getting into some new territory, I think, which is this idea of social media, political activity, and protected activity savings. And this actually has been almost implicated, because there was a law that was just passed by the General Assembly, which outlaws certain communications in certain contexts from being made by employers to their employees about political matters. This doesn't get to that, but since we're now seeing legislation in that area, if the General Assembly passed laws that made certain things a labor law violation to address what an employee is saying or doing, for example, on their social media, then this has language in there that says, hey, if there's a change in the law like that, then this policy would persist, but for something that would make it unlawful, essentially a savings clause. So the overall scope of this is that it, number one, makes clear that you can't misuse town technology, that it's for use in furtherance of the town's functions and the job duties of the person, and that, workplace social media activity is limited again, like, the town has a Facebook, there's a town YouTube page, there should be no other, social media activity going on aside from those particular purposes, especially when you're talking about town resources. And then there's just a general, very clear language that you can't utilize town resources for any sort of political activity. That includes,
This doesn't apply to an employee's personal devices, personal account, anything like that. Okay.
town resources.
Just to clarify.
Now, if you're on the clock and you're sitting there
That's different.
tweeting.
No,
Yeah.
I get that, but like anything outside of work hours that's on a personal device is outside of this purview, right?
It's focused on town resources,
Okay.
right? And then it talks about how, even though we have these general prohibitions, in the savings language, the town's general policy is not intended to restrict lawful off-duty political activity. To your question, protected reports to government agencies, participation in investigations, protected speech, or other legally protected rights. Like you could, for example, saying, oh, you can't electioneer where you can't engage in certain types of speech with town resources. That doesn't mean that the person can't file a complaint with the EEOC, or that they can't file a complaint of like an unfair labor practice charge with the NLRB, right? Those things are protected, and the policy recognizes that. Drug-free workplace and medical marijuana. So medical marijuana is a new area that I did not see addressed in your handbook, so this is definitely new territory, and I think it needs to be there. There is a carve-out in the medical marijuana law which says that if there's any sort of federal, like, because of federal law involving the use of marijuana and certain like licenses, like for example, if somebody in your public works had to maintain a CCLD, a commercial,
CDL.
yeah, CDL, excuse me. I believe under current federal regulation, you can't be a card holder and also have a CDL. So that would be an example where, yes, the general policy of the town is that we're not going to discriminate against a medical marijuana card holder, and it's making clear as we're administering those sorts of things that that cannot be done. However, the federal requirement for the person to have that licensure to like maintain their job in public works, for example, would trump this. This language tracks that, which is essentially what current Delaware law, current sort of like best practice is from like an employment law HR standpoint. But the handbook didn't mention this. It's been around for a little while. It keeps getting refined and expanded. I think it's important to have this language if something should arise. That way, Rhiannon and to the extent that we end up hiring more employees, if somebody becomes like the head of public works and they have somebody who's a subordinate at some point, that would be an example of where, okay, what do I do with my employee? They say they have a card, we can't discriminate against card holders. Well, here's some guidance for how to navigate that situation. And then, obviously you could call me if it's really a close call.
So how do we navigate the fact Delaware is a legal recreational state as well, so card holding wouldn't matter one way or the other as long as they weren't impaired on the job?
So you can prohibit use of marijuana or any sort of recreational activity as the employer always. So there's nothing in making that legal that, personal use, possession, so on. Also, there are still limitations about the amount to possess and using it in public and certain things like that remain at the very least at the level of civil citations. Right. So there are still issues involving compliance with the law, broadly speaking there, but the reality is that the current status quo, which remains the case, is that you can prohibit use, whether it be, an edible or actually smoking marijuana, certainly, or vaping, which I think is becoming more common. You can prohibit use and you can prohibit, obviously, inebriation, although it's more difficult to test for something like that outside of like a field sobriety type thing or something like that, which even then, that is not a perfect answer. But to answer your question, as the employer, you can still have a policy, and I think it's good from a workers' comp claim standpoint and a safety standpoint to essentially set it as we're going to be as prohibitive as we can. And then obviously there are other constraints when it comes to federal licensure. There are likely constraints when it comes to post and the certifications that are available there for LEOs that would trump the general policy, which recognizes that there can be carve-outs to those regulatory structures, but that in any event, whatever the medical marijuana law says, that you have to defer to those regulatory parameters. Chief, am I doing a good job describing this? I know that you've got direct experience as this has evolved and you've been pulling people over by medical marijuana cards.
Perfect.
Very good. Perfect. That's what I like to hear. Any other questions about medical marijuana or how we're approaching that? So, okay, so it's drafted. I would summarize that the language that's in there is drafted for a way to be as safe as possible in the workplace. No use on the premises, no being impaired with any substance, right? So FLSA exempt salary basis protection, it adds a savings clause noted that the handbook authorizes deductions as appropriate and as permitted by the FLSA and applicable law, and that any improper deductions or things that employees feel like, well, why is this being deducted? That should be communicated so that the town can correct it, which is always good practice. You don't want to have someone who's sitting there with improper deductions, remaining quiet, and then suddenly you've got an FLSA compliance issue on your hands. you wouldn't want that. Moving on to items 10 and 11. So these may need to be addressed at the time that this is in a final format to be adopted by council. This is just a workshop, so we're obviously not gonna be voting on this today, but I had asked Rhiannon to recirculate to me the draft that Councilman Nelson had previously prepared. And as I was getting ready, and then ultimately in the car, I don't know if I ultimately saw that come through yet. And so I would want time to review that and make sure that this is harmonized. The one concept broadly that I can point out that is in there is that there is this idea of like a transition period, so that you're not like divesting people of certain things that they were used to, or certain amounts that haven't expired, and just saying, well, we're jettisoning that and here's the new regime. So there's transition period language in here for both vacation and sick. But, you know, I couldn't just readily recall or locate the packet where that was discussed. I couldn't remember exactly when that was being addressed, and there's so many other things that we're touching upon here that I kind of just made a note of that in the memo and then moved on. So we can always return to that discussion, but what's being done here is really just a clarification to make more clear the way that things get accumulated and how carryover works. Because I think that there's been a lot of confusion involving that in practice, like whether or not the language in the handbook was actually being applied. I don't believe it really was. I think ADP was kind of off doing its own thing, and there were other employees that thought they had accumulations that they really didn't have, based upon what the language clearly says, which is that, you know, the actual language were to be followed in your current handbook says, you know, you accumulate based upon years of service, and then you use it or lose it, and you only get to bring over 1 year, and that's only if there's a request that is approved by council. So I don't think in practice that was necessarily being assiduously followed, and so it's led to confusion. My recommendation for PTO right now is and continues to be that you follow the policy, and I think that the changes that I was suggesting here is really clarification and making it more obvious, like what the actual policy is, because there was some like vague language in the handbook about how accumulations worked, and it says that it gets accumulated in the handbook, but then in practice, we were just giving people their vacation like on day one of the new calendar year, which that's the opposite of accumulation. That's just like, here's all of your vacation time. So there's a way that we can harmonize the major concept from the prior draft, which was really to take the idea of like all these different types of leave and just have one large bank, and then move in the direction of having like a different way of utilizing types of requests. So look at types of requests and just have one unified bank. So for example, if there was a request under a sick function, you would have a certain way of making that request, and then it would go against the bank. If there was a request for normal PTO, then it would be done differently. It might need to be planned ahead. There would be different approvals and things that would be involved, right? So that was the direction that was discussed at a previous meeting. I think the main takeaway is that we want to make it clear and easily followed, and then make sure, as this is one of the changes that would be implemented, that once the new process goes into place, have a touch base with the chief and with the town manager to make sure that do employees understand it, is it working out for them, are they finding that there's enough leave? Because obviously the goal here is not to jam anybody up and make it unfeasible for a good employee to, they have an emergent childcare issue or an emergent health issue or anything else. That's not the focus. The focus is just to make sure that it's clear. The other thing is, and this is obviously like the current way it is, and there's no like requirement, and I find that there's confusion about that. It's something that is ultimately the discretion of council, but there are some municipalities and some government bodies that allow for cash out of various types of leave, and there are others that don't. in Delaware, it's up to the discretion of whatever the policy or handbook or rule is for how those get handled. I know that in the municipal space, this is like something that's sort of looked at as like, can we get a good employee to stay around or give us more notice or do whatever as like a carrot approach to address that part of the discussion, because obviously you're in public sector employment. One of the trade-offs is that you don't get paid as handsomely as you might in the private sector with a for-profit entity. You know, you've got a small town with limited means and all that sort of thing. So I raise that just to suggest that it's something that you may wish to consider. And part of the reason why we're doing this workshop is to talk about these items, allow you to ask any questions that occur to you, but also so that you can consider what you think is the best for the town. I think limited PTO payout makes sense. An idea where we're giving people like very significant amounts and very significant windfalls is probably not the best use of the public's resources. There's probably a happy medium in there. But I just wanted to mainly point out that the question of how any payout works or whether to have payout at all is something that is firmly within your discretion as the employer. And I'm not making a real recommendation about whether to. I would just make sure that the language, whatever you decided, was clear and able to be followed so that, you know, from a legal standpoint, if there's a fight over it, it's easy to get to a reasonable outcome. The question of whether or not to have it is really a policy question for all of you as the policymakers. Moving on to the FMLA wrinkle, it's very interesting. So technically, you folks are subject to FMLA, even though you have a very small number of employees, because the default under the law is that all public sector employers are subject to FMLA. Well, then why doesn't FMLA really apply to our employees? Because in fact, it doesn't. The reason for that is because there's another requirement from the employee request standpoint, which says that in order to make a successful request to qualify for that sort of leave, that there has to be a certain number of employees working within a certain mile radius within a certain number of months. And so because Greenwood is so small, although the FMLA technically applies to you, there's no qualifying employees here because of how the law works. The way that it was before didn't really recognize that wrinkle. It's kind of like an employment law, like nerd wrinkle that it technically applies, but would a request ever actually qualify? This is not to suggest that any sort of like short-term disability or other benefits that you have would not apply. They would. You know, you can have other benefits and other sorts of considerations aside from just like, do I have to hold someone's job for 12 weeks under the FMLA? That's really what that question is. That doesn't mean that you can just terminate someone willy-nilly if they go out on an injury and they have an active comp claim, or they're evaluating whether or not they need to make a request for reasonable accommodations under the ADA because of an emergent and persistent health concern. So the message is that although FMLA doesn't apply, that's typically thought of as like, well, that's the safe zone, the 12 weeks, like how would employees have stability? The reality is that from an employment law standpoint, I would not recommend just releasing someone in employment who's on some sort of leave without consulting with me and evaluating what their specific factual situation is. So I wanted to mention that while we're discussing it, but that language kind of recognizes the wrinkles there of how that actually works. That yes, you're covered by the FMLA, but no, there's no circumstance right now where there would be a qualifying request for that because you have an insufficient number of employees working within the required radius under the law, the required area. So there's a section that we added about volunteer emergency responders leave, which is a reference in the law that is kind of like a placeholder, and that, you know, you'll require it when required by the law. So again, it's an acknowledgement that, hey, if you've got, all this says is that if you've got a volunteer emergency responder and they request leave, is basically to look at it in the handbook, don't make the determination on your own, you know, confirm the number of employees you have, full-time and part-time, come to us, we'll see if there have been any changes in the law, and we'll let you know if there's some sort of item that the town has to be concerned about. But we inserted a placeholder for that. The inclement weather policy is different. The current language says that you've got, it ties it closely to the Sussex County and the state of Delaware office closures. And it doesn't necessarily specifically delineate like what happens with the PD under your current policy. It actually affirmatively excludes them. So the proposed draft gives the town manager or a designee of the town manager the authority to determine town operational status, which is probably the right way to do it. And then it creates the concept of essential and non-essential employee categories, addresses the idea of remote work, and clarifies how compensation works. And it keeps the concept of like, if you're actually having to physically report here to like clear the sidewalks, if you're in public works, or there's some other essential function that needs to be addressed, like somebody's got an issue with their water and you've got to deploy someone, you have to go out in the elements and it's on town business, then you get time and a half. That's still preserved in this policy. It just makes it much more clear like how this actually works in a matter of practice. So moving on to 16, there is a law that did not seem to be really recognizing the fact that this is a legal requirement. If somebody's a current employee and they ask for their file, it just said you can access it and here's how, but it didn't really like reference the fact that there is a law that says you must do this. So we've updated the language to include reference to the specific law, and that there has to be a reasonable time frame for inspection, and it adds in like procedures and guardrails, and other sorts of items that could arise in that context, as well as making it clear that you can't just like take files from the town premises unless authorized or required by law, because those are the town's materials, which is again consistent with what the statute says. Even though it's your personnel file, you can review it and inspect it. And it also, there's a section of it that says that if there's adverse material being placed in your file, that you have the right to respond to that and have that placed in your file as an employee next to the adverse material. But what the statute does not require, and what the town is not required to do, is to allow someone to just take their file and skedaddle off the premises. So it makes clear what those parameters are, and I think it's important where appropriate to point out the fact that there's laws that cover this stuff, because the reality is that if you violate the law, you could be reported to the Department of Labor, you could be subject to a fine. I don't think that there's any exemption for a municipal employer that treats you as anything else than an employer here, unlike the Wage Payment and Collection Act, which actually, the definition of that law, it actually exempts municipalities and governmental entities as being considered an employer. There's no such exemption language here. I pointed out earlier that arbitration is not added, which is just a function of certain case law that's been out there about like how it's frowned upon to have like plenary binding arbitration language specifically in a handbook. So it makes it clear that if there were an agreement to arbitrate, it wouldn't be via function of the handbook. It would be in a separate employment contract or some sort of separate agreement between the town and the employee. We've not revised the current language. We want to confirm who the town's benefits broker and plan administrator is for COBRA, and that's something that I can do with Rhiannon before we get a version that's like ready for prime time for you to adopt. And then finally, the employee acknowledgement. 22 version of the handbook omitted a page within the appendix itself for an employee acknowledgement, or just kind of like plopped at the beginning without any real delineation of it being any particular or special item, and it in fact is, for a variety of reasons, which I will talk about the importance of the employee handbook. But I put it in the appendix because that's where I've always seen them with other handbooks I've drafted and prepared. So it's clear that like, here's this additional item that's not really part of the handbook, but it's a thing that you should have addressed and have in the employee's file when this is updated. And so it adds a lot of things in there for clarity. The importance of this is that, for example, if somebody makes an unemployment insurance claim, one of the things that will be looked at to determine whether or not there was just cause to release someone from their employment is whether or not there was clarity regarding their expectations. Because if you're releasing someone from employment, and you just do it because you felt like you didn't like, the color of hat they were wearing one day. That's no reason at all. But that's not like a standard of conduct or something they were advised of in advance, aside from it being kind of silly. So from an unemployment perspective, there would likely be no just cause in the I don't like green hats, you're fired, fact pattern. So, you have this acknowledgement to make it clear that, hey, here is the expectation. There's a code of conduct in here. It also reemphasizes the fact that there are complaint reporting processes that are in the handbook, that there's anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policies in the handbook. So it's a clear acknowledgement of like the more important processes of the handbook, the fact that the employee has reviewed it, understands it, and is going to, comport their conduct accordingly, which matters. You want to have clarity on those expectations. If expectations are clear, the employees follow them, and makes for a harmonious working environment, which is what we all want. The other thing I'll say about the employee acknowledgement wrinkle is that in the context of like other sorts of allegations of like wrongdoing, whether it's like, by way of example, whistleblower retaliation or pregnancy discrimination, which that's its own protected category with its own separate area of the law. Women's auxiliary retaliation, because that's now also, if you're a member of the Women's Auxiliary, it's actually a protected class now as well. It actually has been for quite some time. But whatever sort of alleged misconduct under the law there is, if you have this acknowledgement and clarity about follow-ups on the expectations in the handbook, which is kind of like your roadmap for how to deal with those issues, and you're documenting that, that's part of the essential documentation to make sure that you're not being perceived as doing something for an improper purpose. So the handbook acknowledgement is like the first brick in that wall to protect the town's interest against those sorts of accusations if they were to ever arise. So that is a summary of the changes. I've been talking for a long time, which I'm totally comfortable with, but I will pause now and reemphasize my point of being here to answer any questions or address any concerns about these proposed changes.
The other question, but it got answered when you were doing it. So the vacation, we were talking PTO time, the thing that essentially the council had voted on, hey, take this, what I had drafted up and blend it in. You answered the question because I was reading, it's page 24.
Yeah.
It's new language, accrued unused vacation will be paid upon separation only to the extent required by the town's policy in effect at the time of the separation. I'm like, where does it say? So the guidance, I get what you're looking for. This is my belief as a council person. Any unused accrued PTO should be paid out to employees who just leave through normal means. Anybody who's terminated, they don't get anything.
That's also,
It's very clear, it's black and white.
and that can be your policy as well.
Yeah.
You can have a policy that says,
Resignation.
resignation, you get it.
Yep.
If you get canned for some reason, because you're gonna follow what the handbook says and make sure there's just cause anyway, so that you're protected against an unemployment claim, and we're gonna make sure that that happens, at least as long as I'm here helping you with your employment law stuff, then that is sort of like a ready-made reasonable position, because you're only going to be terminating, even though there's no requirement that you terminate folks for cause. Basically, in practice, you're only going to be terminating folks for cause and documenting that, because you don't want to have to start shelling out a bunch of money for, $13,000 on unemployment benefits because you should not have terminated someone in a given circumstance.
So anything outside of termination, you get your payout upon separation.
Okay.
And then my only other thing would be the sick time. Well, I saw it suggested up to like 5 days instead of like so many hours. You get 5 days right off the jump on the yearly. If you don't use that 5 days, you can't transfer that over to another year. You can't pay that out. You get 5 days no matter what. You either use it or lose it. There's no payout on termination for that. There's, for sick time anyways. It's there for your convenience.
Right.
But it's separate from vacation.
And that's how I think the current language is, but that's how, that's what our draft looks to as well.
Okay.
Yeah, because sick is there, it's a different thing.
It's something you provide for your employees, like, so they don't have to burn vacation time if they're sick.
Yes.
So I just had a couple questions. I guess this was what was proposed by council and provided to Mr. Del Colo. I remember seeing it, but I don't remember actually getting a physical copy of it with like what the stipulations were gonna be. My biggest concerns that I have current employees who are facing this is, are we still having to wait a whole year before an employee can utilize their vacation time? Or is that been
That's jettisoned in this
dissolved?
language.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Secondly, the whole PTO thing in itself, we're still mentioning sick, and this old thing says 5 days of sick. The difference and the problem that I have is 5 days for a general employee is 8-hour days. My employees work 10-hour days. So for them to use a day, they're technically using a day and a half, if you see what I'm saying.
So would you suggest a separation for 50 hours, 5 days for police department, 40 hours, 5 days for public?
Something in that nature, or the terminology of a day for a day.
That's fair.
A day means a day.
No, that's fair.
I think really what you need is a definition of like what day means perhaps to make it clear. This is kind of vague right now. I think when this was put together, we looked at the current policy, which is an hour policy. And, you know, looking at how many hours it was actually less days. If you look at it as like an 8-hour day under the current policy. So this one's a little bit more generous than that, but I get your point.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I couldn't recall the actual numbers that Councilman Nelson had suggested. And from what I recall, it was laid out in hours and not specifically in days. But I just wanted to notate that, yeah, like a day is different for a general employee than it is for a patrol officer who's a 10-hour day. And I feel like that might be a detriment to the officer that might not be getting the same, benefit. If they call out sick, then they're burning more time than a regular employee would, but they're getting the same accrued time that a regular employee would.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a bit of a detriment for the officer.
Ladies and gentlemen, Chief, I'm sorry, I appreciate your time, I gotta get rolling. You'll have a good evening, and I'll see you all later.
Take care.
So as of right now, we're just waiting for that new draft, and basically all of this is kind of what's getting dissolved.
Yeah, so, there is a current draft that's, and I'll re-forward it to you, that is a bunch of underlined,
Oh, I've been handed it. Thank you.
it's 22, like 30 some odd pages, and then there's a 4-page memo. So I'll re-forward that to you, but what I could not locate for the life of me was Councilman Nelson's draft ahead of this presentation today, which ultimately is not really any lost time because we're just discussing this now. And I will have a finalized version with more of an update when we're ready to vote on this, which I would imagine will be at the time of the next regularly scheduled council meeting.
Yeah.
If we have time to notice it for the following one.
What he's talking about, we have something similar where I'm at. For 1 to 5 years of service, you would get a day and a quarter a month. That would be vacation or sick time. And then 5 to 10, you would get a day and a half a month. And then and then up 15 plus, you would get day and 3/4. And those are like, we'll just say right now I've got X amount of hours. I can use up into however I see fit, but if I go to retire, then I only have to get paid for X amount. But on vacation, I can roll over, like right now I'm over 15 years, so I can roll over 42 days a year. But I have to take, each year I've got to burn what X amount. So I got to take whatever it shows that I say, if I've got 300 hours on the books, I got to divide that by whatever, and that tells me how many days I have to use by the end of the year. And if I don't use those days, they're gone.
Right.
So I don't know if that's what we have in here.
Both of them have a use it or lose it factor. And the idea of like you're encouraged to utilize and only so much can like roll over, if any. I know that like our draft, meaning the ones that I prepared before I saw Councilman Nelson's, was basically like it just allowed for, instead of having this rigmarole about you have to request it and council has to approve it, it's like, why is council even approving a rollover of 1 week? Like, you guys are running the town. Like that to me, I mean, it matters, but it's kind of like an administrative function that is nonsensical to me, given how busy council is. So, my draft just said, you can carry over a week, period. No request, 1 week and 1 week only is carried over. It eliminates this whole requesting thing. So that's how mine read. Councilman Nelson's was different because you have one giant pool of leave. And then, the one thing it didn't define was the types of requests.
So does that mean, is that saying we're giving,
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have it with me
And-
because,
I mean,
Oh.
we're giving one big
Oh, okay.
amount and then they have it to pick from however they want? So
yes,
if you're sick and you need to take a day, then you've got a day and you're going to.
yes.
We're gonna subtract the day. So if you got 50 days on the book and you're out sick for 5 days, well, okay, now you only got 45 days.
Thank you, Rhiannon. Pass it down. Yeah, Mike, you've got it. The issue at the time that Rhiannon and Chief brought up, which was a good point, that in Anthony's now version on page 24 is, what can we carry over? Because they brought up there can be confusion with that. So he cleaned that side up on the suggested of, hey, this is the accrual part. So it's just by hours. That way it's like, hey, you don't have to worry about the police. You're collected 12 hours a month. Well, it's a 10-hour day. Okay, well, how many hours you got? You're not having to, I was trying to keep it what I call the AK-47, super simple. It runs, basically you can say to somebody, what, can't you read? This is very easy to understand.
No, this makes, I
But
got it in my hand.
But the side thing, Chief brought up something that's haunted me, and I've been waiting for a call on this, because I would literally tell the person, I would be worried that all right, let me put it this way. When it got proposed to you, a break in service, so you were here for 3 years, never took a vacation, so what would that be? 36 hours. 36, the belief that if you came back to employment, that would pick back up again. Even the state doesn't do that,
The only way that I've ever seen that happen is for purposes of definitions of seniority in a collective bargaining agreement.
Right,
So
CBA.
it has to be an expressly bargained for employee benefit from what I've seen. To me, and I thought about this scenario as well, the chief may have even mentioned it to me. But my view of that is that everything ceases.
Yeah.
Your benefits cease. You can only stay on the town's COBRA benefits for up to 18 months under federal law. That ceases. You don't continue to get a paycheck. You don't continue to get to contribute to your 401k. I mean, you can with your own recognizance, but not through the town's payroll. All of the other group of benefits that you have go away. So to me, you
It's
come
a
back,
non-starter.
there's a new day one.
Yeah, and if we pay it out, say they leave on good terms, well, under the new policy, we just paid your unused PTO
Right.
to a certain point. It
That's the other
was
thing,
just
too, is
something
that
to
you
talk
have to
about
be-
because it did come up.
Yeah, logically speaking, you would have to be, and I think that particular question was about what years would I fall in? Would I still have my old years of service? I think, because it wasn't so much would I then accumulate more and have my old leave bank? Really, it was what years of service would I have? And so from my perspective, absent a statement to the contrary, if you leave and you're no longer an employee, then that segment of your career, your prior role is concluded. If you return, then all of this stuff starts back up again, obviously, but then that's day one.
I think it's a common misinterpretation from the law enforcement side. We see the word service, right? So I can do 3 years of service here and go start somewhere else. I don't start my years of service over. I'm now continuing on my 3rd year and 4th year. So that's where the misinterpretation comes. That's where this question was posed. The employee was like, hey, I previously worked here. I had X amount of years. This year would put me at 5 years of service. I feel as though I'm entitled to the 4 to 6 year service now. We've ran into a similar situation at one of my other previous places of employment, and we simply just put the word continuous. Must be continuous. There can be no breaks.
Right.
of service. You don't come from another agency and say, I had 5 years there, so now I'm on year 6. No, continuous service with this entity, not your previous years of service.
I think in DuPont, the way they did it, it was used in terms of retirement. They gave 15 years and then you left, you came back and you worked 10 years, well, you got 25 years towards retirement, not benefits, just retirement.
But you were in CBA too then, weren't you? You were union.
No.
Were you a white hat? Okay, that's why. All right.
And I mean, you know, you didn't, when you come back, you had 15 years and you come back and you worked a year, you got 16 years, but you don't have 16 years in terms of benefits for vacations and none of those things. As far as retirement, you had it, but not for that.
Right.
Because
And it's something that I will, you know, when this is put into final, you know, this is the last sort of like loose end as far as like what we're proposing for all of the numerous updates we're proposing. So when this is put into final, I will, in fact, I'll also make a note of it, but I know that I will recall this particular discussion and make sure that it's abundantly clear that you don't get to just, you know, you're the, you know, public works person here, and then you leave for 3 years, then you come back and get hired to be the clerk. Okay, well, that doesn't now mean that after 2 years of being the clerk, you've got 5 years at the town and you suddenly start accumulating all of this leave. I don't think that's what the policy was meant for. That's not how I read it. Yeah. But I'll make sure it's clear.
So somebody knew a guy, he had X number of years, he was a law enforcement. He had X number of years, he went to another department. His years carried.
Yes, our years of service do carry. They should not gain you any further benefits.
Because he came up, he had X number of years of service as a law enforcement officer, then a job opened, and because he had all these years, he was ahead of the guy that just.
Yeah, that's different. And so technically, I mean, through the departments I've worked for, if you cumulatively, I have 25 years of service. That doesn't mean I'm entitled to 25 years of service with benefits from the town of Greenwood.
Right.
That's just a misinterpretation from the law enforcement side. When our view of the word service is different than the general public or the general employee's view of the word service.
We really need to clarify that, because he may not be the chief 10 years from now.
Yeah, I mean, that's an easy argument that an attorney could be like, no, service means service, doesn't mean it continues on, and
Yeah.
We cleaned it up at my previous employer by just stating it's continuous service with this entity. Doesn't mean anything else counts, you don't walk in the door higher ranked than anybody. So if I left here today and I became a patrol officer for the police department next door, all my service ranks would still be there, because you can't take my years of service away, but I'd have no rank, I'd be a patrolman with all these years of service. That's just how the law enforcement world works.
Great, anybody else have anything?
I'm good with it.
Mr. Moran?
The voluntary emergency response.
Yes.
What would that really identify?
So there's a law out there that
So,
talks about how and when that leave kicks in. I didn't like put the whole recitation in the handbook, but
so
basically if somebody's in that category, you know, Rand would say, hey, we have somebody who's requested leave, they may fall into this, and I would check and make sure that you're compliant.
what is a voluntary, I mean?
I believe it's like,
Firefighter?
yeah, it's like a firefighter. Sometimes, there used to be more voluntary EMTs, that's basically a way of the past.
Now.
Yeah, but I think now this essentially means firefighter, essentially.
So, I mean, obviously, I mean, if I was to go to an alarm, I just have to have the chief sign a paper that I give it to my employer, and I get paid starting at my normal time.
Right. So I think that there's this concept in the law about people who deploy for a more extended period of time to respond to like a natural disaster, right? I believe that's what's being gotten at, if I recall.
For the hurricanes.
Yes, or like, you know, God forbid, if like there's something, if a train capsizes and there's a chemical spill, and then they have to pull in activate a bunch of people through DEMA, and you're a volunteer, you know how to do the cleanup, and it's like massive and it takes multiple days, that may be, you're needed in the community to do that. There may be some leave that would need to kick in for that. Or like for a more conventional hurricane, flooding, whatever, rescue operation, that sort of thing. I think it's more so like, I think one alarm, you're out for a little while is already done as a regular course of business. This to me is more so an extended period of leave for some sort of unusual circumstances, what I think the law is getting at.
Okay, anybody else? Brianna? Chief?
I have one more thing. I believe let me find it again. So it's under, police employees in reference to employee benefit for pension. Carolyn kind of brought this to attention, so, under the section, it's just basically got some old information in here. The last time it was updated, it says as of August 1st, 2009, that basically 13% of the employee's gross wages are paid. That number should vary. It varies every year depending on the state. The only thing that doesn't change is the contributions made by the officers. That should be the set rate of 7%. But I know this is kind of old information. I don't know if we just want to add something in there that
I would just
this rate
under
varies.
into the plan under section 8842 and remove the percentage.
Yeah, I mean, because that rate
You
is
could say
Because
consistent,
changes
you could say
from year.
consistent with the law or something.
Yeah, exactly. Because it varies every year. It changes.
Right.
The only thing that doesn't change is the percentage of the contribution percentage of the employee.
Right. We can do that.
Yeah,
That's easy.
I had, in your ethics in employment, it says you can't appoint or vote for the appointment of, and it lists all types of family, but it does not include spouse.
Done?
Mhm.
But you know what page you're on?
Page 10, father, mother, son, daughter, sister, brother, uncle, aunt, nephew, first cousin, mother-in-law, father-in-law, brother-in-law, sister-in-law, son-in-law, daughter-in-law.
So we should probably, I mean, that would certainly be prohibited under the state ethics law. We can add that.
I just thought, since it lists all these other relations.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is, I'll note that that is, I will note that, because that's not underlined, that would be the current language, but I will make sure it's updated. Yes, I think that's a good addition.
Anything else, Carl? Anybody else?
I got a couple typos.
Beg pardon?
Just a couple typos.
She's all about that typo, buddy, I'll tell you that. I don't think you can get away with that typo deal. Not with her.
I will say I did catch the part in your current handbook where there was an entire, like, copy and pasted repeated section that was presented to council in that form, it would appear, by certain folks in the past and voted on. But that's been corrected, so.
Very good.
Okay, don't have anything else? Do we have anything for executive?
I do have some updates for you.
We don't have that paragraph and a half about this. Executive session to consider advice and strategy submit sessions with an attorney at law regarding potential litigations, 29(C). That will suffice. I mean, we don't want to get into a FOIA.
That's, yes,
Okay.
that suffices.
Motion to go into executive session.
Okay, I have a motion by Mr. Moran. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Nelson. Okay, Mr. Moran, how do you vote?
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Willie,
Yes.
Mr. Nelson,
Yes.
and I vote yes. It is now 8:04 and we are in executive session.